if Lord Peter Wimsey had not made a slightly sardonic remark about the acoustics of rural church bells in Sussex, the entire matter might have passed unremarked and undetected, save for a small obituary in the Morning Post and some quiet fuss over the redistribution of modest family funds. It was at precisely 2 minutes past 11 on a mist-swaddled Tuesday morning that Wimsey, resplendent in a mustard-colored +4 suit of nearly offensive confidence, stood on the cracked slate steps of St. Cuthbert's Rectory in the village of Cliff-in-Marsh, squinting upward at the ancient belfry. The bell had just tolled the hour, followed by a single, belated chime as if regretting the effort. "Curious," he said, turning to the Reverend Simon Dallinger, who had been nervously fiddling with his muffler. 11 strokes, quite punctual, but that final echo was distinctly an F-sharp. Bells should not modulate. It's rather like a bishop humming Gilbert and Sullivan under his breath during the Eucharist. Entirely unsettling. The rector, a worn man with the aspect of one perpetually surprised by the passage of time, made a noise somewhere between apology and bafflement. "It's a very old bell, Lord Peter. Possibly tuned to something antique. We've had it since the Civil War, I think." "Yes, though one wonders which side it was on," said Wimsey with a vague wave at the fog-bound graves. "Still, one doesn't come to Cliff-in-Marsh for tonal accuracy. Rather for death, it seems." It was not spoken cruelly, merely as if death, like fungus or gooseberry jam, was something that naturally occurred in these parts and had lately got a bit out of hand. The trouble had begun, as village troubles often do, with a breakfast tray that arrived cold. More precisely, it arrived untouched. Miss Honoria Fledge, a retired governess of fixed opinions and rattling decanters, had failed to rise that Monday morning. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Thirkell, an upright widow with whiskery eyebrows and the rare talent of making porridge taste accusatory, found her mistress still in bed, neat as a tucked napkin, but quite cold and quite dead. At first there had been no suspicion. Miss Fledge had been 77, famous for having a constitution like a gunboat. But gunboats, too, may quietly founder in still waters. The local doctor, a man with a stammer and a fondness for golf, had declared it natural causes and begun to fill out the appropriate slips. But then had come the complication, the matter of the will, or rather, the matter of the 2 wills. One, dated 18 months ago, left nearly everything to a certain Mr. Edgar Trull, an affable nephew in the insurance trade who played the violin poorly and visited twice a year. The other, discovered by accident behind a row of sardine tins in the larder, was dated last Thursday and left the bulk of the estate. A modest but pleasing arrangement of stocks and bonds, a cottage, and a pearl brooch of disputed origin to the Church of the Penitent Lantern, a rather obscure religious order known locally for their fondness for vinegar fasting and anti-electric sermons. "And the pearl brooch?" Wimsey asked now lightly. "Still missing, I presume?" Reverend Dallinger blinked. "Why, yes. How did you—" Wimsey, who had not yet been informed of this, smiled vaguely and looked up at the crooked weather vane. "Lucky guess. Or perhaps divine inspiration. We may call it a miracle if the coroner gets obstinate." He turned on his heel and began walking toward the rectory gate, the heel of his left shoe making a faint tick where the cobble had worn concave. "Come, Bunter. We must pay our respects to the deceased, and perhaps also to her dog, who, I understand, did not bark in the night. Most obliging of him." Bunter, gliding noiselessly in his usual incarnation as butler, valet, and moral conscience, gave a single blink of assent. "Very good, my lord." The dog in question, a gnarled, middle-aged terrier of indiscriminate origin and suspected melancholia, had indeed slept through Miss Fledge's death. Nor had he stirred when she was carried out. He had not whimpered, howled, or shown any sign of disturbance. He had simply continued to sleep. Wimsey found that fact both utterly charming and deeply suspicious. Mrs. Thirkell received Lord Peter Wimsey in the front parlour of No. 4, Larchmere Cottages, with the firm expression of a woman who considered visitors to be a form of contagion, possibly airborne. She wore black bombazine and a brooch containing a dull photograph of a gentleman who might once have been her husband, her brother, or a minor bishop. Wimsey bowed over her hand with a courtesy that hovered, just so, between sincerity and polite mockery. "You'll forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Thirkell," he said. "I've come to inquire into Miss Fledge's passing, on behalf of the late lady's solicitor, and also, as you may have gathered, for my own somewhat irrepressible curiosity." "I dare say," said Mrs. Thirkell, folding her arms like a sentry. "People always get interested in death when it's not their own." Wimsey's eyes twinkled. "Indeed. It's rather like divorce, or a shipwreck. Safest to admire from shore. Now, about Monday morning. I found her at 7:30. I bring in her tray at 7:30 on the dot, unless she rings earlier, which she didn't. Tea, porridge, half a slice of toast with the crust off, and a spoon of marmalade. No butter. Butter's hard on her digestion, or so she said. And did the tray seem ordinary? Quite. Tea had cooled, porridge still steaming, the marmalade hadn't shifted. She hadn't touched a bite. Was there any sign she had stirred in the night? None. Bedclothes were smooth. Book still open on her chest. The cloud of unknowing. Some church thing, I think. She was still wearing her glasses, Lord Peter. Didn't even put them on the nightstand. Wimsey nodded, slowly. Suggestive, that, as though death came gently and without notice. "That's what I thought, sir. So I called Dr. Winterby. He looked her over and said it was probably her heart. She always said it would be the heart. Yet I understand Miss Fledge was robust." Mrs. Thirkell sniffed. "She'd wrestled chickens bare-handed and made 3 burglars cry in her day. But she was old. 77, you said." "I did not, but I'm gratified you agree. Tell me, was there anything out of place in the room? A window left open, for instance?" "Well now, you mention it. The little side window above the desk was ajar, not wide, but open enough for a draught. I closed it when I cleaned the room later. No sign of it having been forced." "Not at all. But there's ivy up the side of the house and an old rose trellis. If someone were determined, I suppose." "Indeed. And what of the dog? Jumble, is it?" "Yes, sir. Mixed with something Scottish and something disagreeable. He sleeps in the scullery. Didn't bark, didn't whine. Slept straight through." Wimsey glanced about the room with idle precision. "You've kept the place in fine order." "She was particular, was Miss Fledge." "And you'd been in her service how long?" 28 years, give or take. Started when her brother died. I was working at the vicarage then, but she made a better offer. I've been here since." "And the nephew?" "Mr. Edgar Trull?" Mrs. Thirkell's face darkened. "Only came when it suited him. Easter and Boxing Day, if that. Always fiddling with his cufflinks and talking about dividends. He didn't like her politics. She didn't like his mustache." "Ah, intergenerational warfare. So he wasn't in the village last week?" "No, sir. He only turned up Tuesday afternoon, after the news broke. She'd written him a letter that Friday, I think. Sealed it with blue wax, which she only did for serious things. I posted it myself. Intriguing. And what of the other will, the one found behind the sardines?" "That was the rector's doing. Came to fetch a hymn book and tripped over the cat in the pantry. Landed against the shelf and there it was, wedged between tinned herring and the pickled walnuts." "A providential feline," murmured Wimsey. "And you recognized her handwriting?" "As clear as my own. That was her style. Long, looping capitals and the sort of underlines that looked like bayonets." "And it named the Church of the Penitent Lantern as beneficiary?" Mrs. Thirkell gave a visible shiver. "Yes, sir. I don't like to speak ill, but they're a queer lot. Always going about in sandals and preaching against the wireless. She'd taken to visiting them lately. Said they brought comfort." More like goose flesh, if you ask me. And where is the pearl brooch? Missing. We searched the jewelry drawer, her safe box, and even her sewing kit. Nothing. She always wore it when she wrote formal letters. She had it on last Thursday, I know that much. Whimsy leaned forward, smiling faintly. You're very observant, Mrs. Thurkell. I am, sir, and I don't think she just died. I think something was done. Because of the will? Because of the dog, she said firmly. He never liked strangers. Barked if the postman even looked sideways. But not a sound, Lord Peter. Not a sound. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift from the garden, and the branches of a hawthorn bush clawed at the panes like impatient fingers. Whimsy rose, thanked her, and stepped into the hallway where Bunter was waiting with gloves and hat. Curious old business, Whimsy murmured as they walked down the garden path. A woman who changed her will, lost her brooch, and died without disturbing her dog. Bunter, what does it suggest to you? That Miss Fledge was dispatched very quietly, my lord. Precisely, and possibly before she ever got into bed. They strolled past the rusted gate and into the lane. Let's examine the timeline, Whimsy went on, mostly to himself. Last seen alive by Mrs. Thurkell at 9 p.m. Sunday night. Writing a letter, still wearing brooch. Tray brought at 7:30 a.m. Monday, untouched, body discovered. Death called natural, but will discovered Tuesday, dated Thursday prior. And sealed in blue wax, Bunter added, for serious matters. Whimsy's brow creased slightly. We must speak to Mr. Trull and the rector again, and perhaps pay a visit to these lantern-waving zealots. But first, I want to look at that window. That afternoon, the bedroom told him very little, but the window told more. The ivy on the trellis had been recently snapped, 2 leaves still green at the break. Whimsy climbed it with surprising agility, peered down and muttered, not an easy entrance, but doable, especially for a man not much heavier than a violin. Back on solid ground, he turned to Bunter. What do you make of it? Ivy disturbed. Room unslept. No dog's alarm. Might suggest the crime occurred earlier than supposed. Or elsewhere, said Whimsy softly. Let's talk to the vicar again. I want to know precisely when he last saw Miss Fledge, and why he was in the pantry when he tripped over that cat. They walked toward the rectory, boots crunching gravel. You think the will was planted? Bunter asked. Possibly. Or hidden by someone else, perhaps even Miss Fledge herself, if she feared what was coming. And the brooch? That may be our real clue. What sort of killer removes a brooch and not the rings on her fingers? Sentimental? Ritual? Or something more precise? As they reached the rectory gate, Whimsy paused. Bunter, did you notice? There were no tea stains on the breakfast tray. Indeed, my lord. Yet the tea was poured, no sign of spillage. No overturned cup, porridge hot, tea cold. The sequence is all wrong. You suspect the tray was prepared after the death, or after the body was placed. A lovely domestic arrangement, too lovely, perhaps. He stepped into the rectory, face alight with gentle malice. And I intend, he said, to ask the vicar what he knows about sardine tins, pantry locks, and exactly where he was between Thursday and Monday. The door closed behind him. The fog returned. Whimsy found the Reverend Dallinger precisely where he expected to, among a teetering stack of psalters in the rectory study, examining the bottom of a teacup with a theologian's frown, as though it might yield some doctrinal error. The room smelled of beeswax, failing paper, and the particular decay of letters written but never posted. Ah, Lord Peter, the vicar said, startled but not displeased. Do come in. You'll forgive the mess. Our choir mistress had a sort of crisis over a misfiled canticle, and everything's been topsy-turvy since. Topsy-turvy, Whimsy echoed, drifting to the hearth and inspecting a brass angel that had been placed upside down among the kindling. Quite apropos. Now, Mrs. Thurkell mentioned something about your stumbling into a will while pursuing ecclesiastical matters in the larder. Dallinger coloured faintly. Yes. Most awkward. I'd come by to collect Miss Fledge's hymnal. It's a fine leather-bound edition with her marginalia, rather opinionated marginalia, I must say. She'd offered to donate it to the parish library. Very charitable of her, said Wimsey, selecting an armchair and seating himself with that graceful, almost feline air that always gave the impression he might not remain seated for long. And the cat? Pandora. Very elderly. Miss Fledge left instructions for her care, though I confess she never quite liked me. Pandora, I mean. I tripped over her just inside the pantry and, knocked into the shelf. A whole row of tins came clattering down. Must have been dramatic. It was. Sardines everywhere, and one rather dusty envelope lodged between a tin of pilchards and a jar of marrow chutney. Had it not been for the spill, I might never have seen it. The will was addressed? Yes. To her solicitor, Mr. Glanville in Tunbridge Wells. Quite proper. Dated Thursday the 5th in her own hand, and witnessed by, myself and Mrs. Thurkell. Indeed. Wimsey leaned forward with interest. I didn't realize you'd witnessed the new will. I thought I'd said. You hadn't? What time was this signing? Let me see. Thursday evening around 6:30, after evensong. Interesting. And when precisely did you drop by to collect the hymnal? Sunday afternoon, just after tea. Not Thursday. The vicar hesitated. No, that wouldn't have made sense. I, wasn't invited then. Wimsey's gaze sharpened. Forgive me, Reverend, but if the will was signed Thursday evening and you witnessed it, why would you say you found it by accident on Sunday? Dallinger flushed deeply now. Oh, yes, that is, well, quite. Yes? I may have misremembered, the man said weakly. It's all been rather confusing. Understandable, said Wimsey mildly, though his eyes glittered. But let us be precise, shall we? On Thursday, you and Mrs. Thurkell witnessed a will that cut out Mr. Trull and bequeathed Miss Fledge's estate to a small vinegar-smelling sect. You did not, however, see her again between Thursday night and her death? No. And when you tripped over Pandora on Sunday and discovered the will again, I may have wanted to verify that she hadn't changed her mind. Of course. A scholarly interest in consistency. Dallinger looked away, fiddling with a smudge on his cassock. Wimsey's tone softened, almost kindly. Tell me, Vicar, how close was Miss Fledge to this Church of the Penitent Lantern? The man's face wrinkled into a series of reluctant lines. She had a fascination. Their founder, Brother Jessup, has a manner about him. Commanding. Talks a lot about purification and simplicity. Not entirely theological in my view, but persuasive in the way one hopes tea leaves are not. She'd been attending their gatherings. Twice weekly. Said she felt cleansed afterward. I found it worrisome. She'd been so rational previously. Was she in the habit of altering her will frequently? Never. The previous one had stood for nearly 2 years. Wimsey stood and wandered toward the study shelves, tapping the titles absently. And Mr. Trull, had she expressed any dissatisfaction with him? Dallinger exhaled through his nose. Only in that she found his conversation to be insufferably eager and underlined by tax evasion. Her words. Delightful woman. He picked up a small bust of Milton, examined its chin, and replaced it. Well, Vicar, I thank you. This has been clarifying. Outside, the mist was thinning into greyish daylight, and Wimsey paused in the rectory garden, considering the sparrows at the feeder with mild curiosity. Bunter, he said without turning. My lord? Our timeline is pinched at both ends. If the will was signed Thursday, witnessed by the vicar and Mrs. Thurkell, and she was seen alive Sunday afternoon, yet the breakfast tray was untouched by Monday morning, then our window is narrow. Roughly 36 hours, my lord. Just so. But here's what disturbs me. The new will was not stored safely. It was placed behind sardines. That strikes me as a temporary hiding place, not a final one. Suggesting she intended to move it elsewhere? Exactly. But someone got to her first. The murderer either did not find the will, or did find it and chose to put it back. Why? Because destroying it might point too clearly at motive, but discovering it later by accident gives it a quaint legitimacy. A divine comedy, if you like. Bunter nodded. Would you like me to obtain Mr. Glanville's opinion on the handwriting? Indeed. And see whether he ever received a letter from Miss Fledge, posted Friday. Mrs. Thurkell claims to have sent it, sealed in blue wax. I want to know what it said. They passed a hedge where the early roses were already collapsing into melancholy heaps of pink. Whimsy paused to examine one, then turned sharply. We'll speak to Mr. Trull. I fancy he's at the inn, polishing his alibi. The Cliff Arms proved to be a low-beamed, sulking sort of place, with carpet that smelled of past cider and a barmaid whose lipstick had declared unilateral war on her chin. Mr. Edgar Trull occupied a window seat with a newspaper folded in unnatural origami, and a whiskey he hadn't yet touched. He rose with a smile too wide by half. Lord Peter Wimsey, this is an honor. And for me, a curiosity, said Wimsey. Do you always visit after your aunt's death, or only when inheritance is in doubt? Troll's smile did not falter. I'd like to think I'm a dutiful nephew. Oh, I'm sure you like to think so. Trull gestured at the chair. Please. Wimsey sat, declining whiskey with a wave. Tell me, Mr. Trull, when did you last speak to your aunt? 2 weeks ago, by telephone. She wanted to know if I'd sent her a copy of my insurance newsletter. I hadn't. And you didn't visit last week? No, I was in Bath. Conference. I have clients there. You didn't receive a letter from her dated Friday? Troll blinked. No. Interesting. Wimsey folded his hands. She wrote one, sealed it with blue wax, posted by Mrs. Thurkell, but you've not seen it. Certainly not. And if she'd written to disinherit you? Trull's expression darkened, just slightly. I'd say she was manipulated. She wasn't well. These lantern people. Fanatics. Indeed. And did you know she kept her brooch in a small velvet case beside her writing desk? I thought she wore it always. Not to bed. It's missing. Then someone stole it, Trull said bluntly. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone removed it to give the impression of something done in peace, rather than struggle. I don't follow. No, said Wimsey, standing. No, you wouldn't. But that's all right, I do. He turned to go, then paused. Tell me, Mr. Trull, do you play the violin with your left or right hand? Right, of course. Why? Just a theory about Ivy, weight distribution, and why the dog didn't bark. He tipped his hat and departed, leaving the nephew blinking behind him. Back in the street, Bunter caught up. Progress? Yes, Wimsey said. We are being lied to in 3 directions, but I rather think the dog has told the truth. All we have to do is translate his silence. He strode off toward Larchmere Cottages once more, the dying light sharpening the outline of each leaf, each tile, each shadow. And somewhere behind a shutter, something waited to be found. The door to Larchmere Cottages was now firmly padlocked, the local constabulary having finally remembered that preservation of evidence was not, after all, optional. A cheerful young sergeant, too cheerful, Wimsey thought, for a scene in which tea had gone untaken and brooches had walked of their own accord, unlocked it for him with the air of a man performing a parlor trick. Bit of a time capsule in there, sir, he said brightly. Couldn't find any sign of forced entry. Not a latch scratched. No dog bites either, murmured Wimsey, stepping across the threshold. He halted a moment just inside, inhaling. Still smells of lavender and biscuit tins. That elusive blend of English maidenhood and genteel defiance. The drawing room was exactly as before. Neat, chill, the fire laid, but unlit. The tray on the sideboard remained untouched, the milk in the small jug curled into silence. Whimsy walked the perimeter slowly, trailing a finger along the furniture as though stroking a sleeping cat. He paused at the escritoire. "Bunter." "My lord." "The key to this drawer. We were told it was locked when the constable arrived, yes?" "Indeed. The village constable had to borrow a hairpin from Miss Marple to access it. She reports being mortified. And the contents? Stamps, correspondence, 2 Valentine cards from 1932, and a shilling in silver. No brooch." "Precisely. Yet that brooch was always kept here. Our dear Miss Fledge was nothing if not a creature of habit. Why remove it before bed? Unless she never reached bed." Bunter raised an eyebrow. "You suspect she was killed earlier than assumed?" "Not quite. But I suspect she never intended to sleep here Sunday night." He knelt and opened the bottom drawer, removing a tartan hold-all, still zipped and faintly musty. "Packed. Half-packed, rather. Flannel petticoat, spare stockings, small traveling flask of brandy. Looks like she planned an overnight. Possibly to visit the lanterns." Whimsy straightened. "Or possibly to avoid them. Look here, this brandy bottle is dusty. She hadn't opened it. Then she packed it earlier and changed her mind. Or someone else changed it for her." The bedroom revealed more puzzles, but none of the particularly exotic variety. No poisoned hat pins or stiletto blades secreted in hymn books. The bed was made crisply, with its coverlet undisturbed, and a copy of Pilgrim's Progress on the side table, open to a chapter in which hopeful converses at length with ignorance. The irony was almost impolite. Whimsy leaned out the window, examining the narrow garden path that ran behind the cottage. Ivy crept up the back fence, lazy in its encroachment. He squinted, noting a small stone statue knocked slightly askew. "Bunter." "My lord, you recall I asked Mr. Trull which hand he used to play the violin?" "Yes." "And he said his right." "He did." "And yet someone climbed the trellis here," Whimsy said, pointing to the faint scuffs on the stone window-sill, "and used their left to steady themselves. Note the trailing print on the frame barely visible. They braced with their left and hoisted with their right. Suggests instinct." "Meaning Mr. Trull may have lied. Or someone else is ambidextrous. Either way, our hypothetical visitor came not through the door, but by unconventional means." "Why avoid the door?" "Because the dog slept through it." He led the way back down, pausing only briefly to inspect a curling map of Kent tacked near the front door. A small red circle had been drawn, eccentric but neat, around a patch of wooded land between the village and the coast. "Winkle Copse," Whimsy murmured. "Ah, yes, the haunt of adolescent truants and minor lovers. Also, if I'm not mistaken, the Lantern's newest encampment. The sect's gathering place, my lord." "Indeed. One suspects Miss Fledge was preparing to confront them. She had, after all, made a will. Such actions rarely stem from serenity. And it was found not in her desk, but behind the pilchards. I believe she meant to take it with her. To give it in person. Or to warn someone that she no longer trusted the village post box. Mrs. Thurkell claims to have mailed 1 letter Friday morning, but if a second was meant to be hand-delivered Sunday evening, the 2 messages may differ." Whimsy stepped back out into the garden, the light now cloud-muted and pale. "Come, Bunter, we shall visit Brother Jessup. I'm told he wears sandals in all weather, which I find either deeply spiritual or deeply silly." Winkle Copse proved no less theatrical than its name. The trees clustered like conspirators, and small red flags had been strung along the branches, fluttering with a certain proprietary smugness. Near a makeshift altar, some converted scaffolding painted a particularly pious shade of mauve, stood a man in a robe of undyed wool and an expression of long-suffering beatitude. "Lord Peter Whimsy," Jessup said, as though it were a weather report. "I had expected you sooner." "Prophetic gift?" "No, Mrs. Thurkell has a regrettably loud voice." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Then you know I'm inquiring about Miss Fledge." She was a seeker, and you, a finder. Only of the lost. She came to us troubled. Did she threaten to revoke her bequest? She said she was conflicted. Conflict, like sin, implies a certain movement. She questioned whether our mission could be sustained without her patronage. I told her we must trust in Providence. Did she seem frightened? Jessop's gaze flickered ever so slightly. She seemed resolute. Did you see her on Sunday? No. Whimsy tilted his head. But she had arranged to visit. She said she might come by in the evening. We waited. She never arrived. Did anyone else come? Just Mr. Troll. He comes sometimes. Says he's researching for a book. Whimsy's smile turned thoughtful. Indeed. Did he happen to visit on Sunday? Jessop didn't reply at once. He came shortly after sunset. Said he was looking for Miss Fledge. Seemed agitated. And did you see him leave? Yes. Alone. No sound of struggle in the underbrush? No glint of a brooch dropped among the nettles? Jessop didn't flinch, but his fingers tightened on the copy of the Psalms for penitent occasions he was holding. She was not harmed here, he said finally, nor by us. No, I dare say not, though you may have helped make her afraid. Whimsy turned, nodding curtly. Come, Bunter. We shall visit the post office. The postmistress, a widow named Mrs. Blenkhorn, wore a lorgnette and a grudge against anything later than second post. She remembered the blue-sealed envelope, odd stationery, smelled faintly of lemons, but had no recollection of where it had been addressed. It was prepaid and sealed. Dropped off by Mrs. Thurkle, she added. Said it was from Miss Fledge. That's all I know. No chance it might have been swapped for another. I never left the counter. Whimsy tapped the wood gently. Then it's possible the letter was intercepted after it left your hands. I don't know how. I do, said Whimsy. It merely requires opportunity, nerve, and the misplaced trust of a woman whose entire life had been predicated on people doing the proper thing. Back in the lane, Bunter said quietly, The letter was never received. The will was not destroyed. Miss Fledge disappears from the record sometime Sunday afternoon. Yes, said Whimsy, and there is still the matter of the dog, which slept soundly. I shall require a violin. My lord? Borrowed, if possible, and a carpet tack. We are going to make the dog tell us what it heard. The violin, an aging Stradivarius knockoff with a temperament to match, was obtained from Miss Marple's cousin, who had once played second fiddle in a touring production of The Yeoman of the Guard, and now taught Sunday hymn arrangements to village children with more hope than success. Whimsy received the instrument with grave courtesy, gave it a tuning that prompted Bunter to wince, and proceeded down the lane toward the Lantern's compound, with the air of a man on his way to a luncheon engagement. It was nearing dusk again, same light as the evening Miss Fledge had vanished. The hedgerows rustled with benign suspicion, and somewhere in the fields a dog barked twice in the distance. Whimsy paused, adjusted the violin under his chin, and plucked experimentally at the E-string. The sound that issued forth was not so much musical as prophetic. It seemed to forecast disapproval in B minor. Bunter, you recall the old experiments, sound and association, Pavlov and all that. But the French, too, had their own conclusions. Early trauma encoded through stimulus, a tone, a smell, a bell. And here, my lord, a fiddle. Precisely. It's not the tone that matters, but the context. You'll recall Mrs. Thurkle mentioned Trull plays the violin poorly. She said he made the dog howl. Exactly, which would be unremarkable, were it not for the curious fact that it no longer does. They stopped before Larchmere Cottage, where Sergeant Gates waited with the patient stoicism of one whose world still made more sense with spanners than with sonatas. Beside him sat the dog, Miss Fledge's black spaniel, ears like ragged crepe and a gaze faintly accusing. Since its mistress's death, it had been docile to the point of reverence. "We've tried everything," Gates said. "Doesn't bark at strangers, postmen, thunder, nothing. Sleeps right through." "Has anyone tried the fiddle?" asked Whimsy mildly. "Not since that Trull fellow. He played out back one night. Gave me a right headache. The dog didn't flinch, though, just sort of stared." "Did he? Let's see how he reacts to a slight variation." Whimsy lifted the bow and, with delicate irony, drew from the strings a fragment of an old folk melody. Tentative, unsure, almost stumbling. A few false notes, a touch too much Rossini. The effect was immediate. The dog stiffened, ears twitching, eyes narrowed in troubled recognition. It let out a faint whimper. Not pain exactly, but a memory trying to find a voice. "Ah," said Whimsy. "There it is. Conditioning, Bunter. Trull played this tune or some variant of it, often enough and near enough, to associate it with some unpleasantness. And now, even in a new key and on a less than cooperative instrument, the dog reacts." Suggesting he was there that night? More than that. He was inside, close enough for the dog to hear and remember, which rather puts the lie to his claim he only passed by the garden. But why wouldn't the dog bark then? Because the dog had learned not to. You recall Miss Fledge described him as kind to animals. But sometimes kindness is code for training. He quieted the dog, perhaps by force, more likely by frequency. Habituation. Our friend Mr. Trull was no casual caller. He was a presence in that house, possibly even had a key. But that would mean that he could come and go unnoticed. Even the servants assumed he never stayed long. And yet I dare say he was there that Sunday before the tea went cold. Whimsy lowered the violin and handed it reverently to Bunter. "Find a safe spot for it, will you? I think it said all it can." The next step, as always, was to disturb someone's supper. In this case, it was Mrs. Thurkel's, a ritual of tinned ham and orange salad, which Whimsy politely declined, though he allowed Bunter to abscond with a biscuit under the guise of taking notes. "You told us," Whimsy began delicately, "that Miss Fledge gave you the letter Sunday morning." "That's right." "And she seemed composed?" "Not. Hurried. She was in her apron still. Said it needed to go out first post?" "Nothing odd." "But you didn't post it immediately?" "Well, I went down about 11:30. There's no box near Larchmere, so I took the walk. Very peaceful." "You saw no one?" "Only Mr. Trull, actually. He was coming out of the village shop. Bought matches and a tin of sardines. Said he was going hiking." "Of course. Matches, sardines, and sonatas. Standard survival fare." Mrs. Thurkel blinked at him. "Forgive me," Whimsy said. "Did Miss Fledge ever speak to you of her will?" "Once or twice. She was worried about the lanterns. Said she'd been foolish, too eager to support them. Asked if I thought the dog would get on in a new place." "She was planning to change the will?" "She had changed it. Said she didn't trust post. I told her to leave it in the desk, but she said no. She wanted to carry it with her. Like a weapon, she said." "Thank you," Whimsy murmured. "That's all very helpful. Very helpful indeed." Outside, he paused under the hedge, adjusting his cufflinks as though they contained hidden clocks. "There it is, Bunter. She carried the will. Not to deliver it, but as insurance. Something frightened her. Something or someone threatened exposure, and she chose to confront it. That will was not just a legal document. It was a declaration of war. And now it's missing." "Indeed. Unless someone forgot to look in the sardine tin." By morning, they had what they needed. Whimsy acquired a map of the footpaths, 2 statements from Trull's publisher regarding overdue manuscripts, and one elderly bell-ringer who remembered, quite vividly, seeing Trull in the churchyard after Compline. Nervous as a ferret he was, looking round like he'd lost his confession. But the coup de grace came from Bunter, who returned from the village library, holding a slim, self-published pamphlet bound in blue thread. Resonant Spaces, the Harmonics of Sacred Places, by Martin Trull. Chapter 5, my lord, he said with quiet satisfaction. Features Winkle Copse extensively, and names Miss Fledge in the acknowledgments for her insight into the oral architecture of secrecy. Whimsy read the line twice. Oral architecture. That's a rather romantic euphemism for eavesdropping, wouldn't you say? Quite. He needed her support, intellectually and financially. She began to realize she was being used, perhaps even blackmailed if he threatened to publish certain conversations or correspondence. So she confronted him, and he silenced her. The dog did not bark. The tea was never poured, and the will so carefully revised was either taken or destroyed. Bunter folded his hands. Shall I fetch the police, my lord? Not yet. I wish to be seen to do something first. We must set the stage, you understand. Whimsy smiled faintly, pulling from his pocket a small carpet tack. We have our dog. We have our violin. What we need now is the drawing-room at Larchmere, a bit of string, and Mr. Trull. If I'm not very much mistaken, the devil will hang himself with his own tuning fork. It was just past 8:30 when Trull arrived at Larchmere Cottage, summoned by a note in Whimsy's own hand, carefully worded, ostensibly courteous, and marked with a faint scent of dried ink and inevitability. The sort of note, Whimsy imagined, that made a man shave too closely, hesitate over which tie to wear, and consider what exactly he might be walking into. He came with a cautious smile and a violin case slung too casually under one arm. I came as requested, he said, stepping into the familiar hallway. I presume this is about Miss Fledge? Whimsy, who was seated at the escritoire, gave him a vague nod. Quite so. There remain a few points in the timeline that puzzle me. I thought it best we discuss them here, on the scene, as it were. There's a clarity in surroundings, don't you think? Trull shifted his weight. Of course. The drawing-room was quiet, faintly echoing. No fire had been lit, and the absence of warmth emphasized the silence in a way that was not wholly comfortable. Bunter stood unobtrusively near the sideboard, polishing a teaspoon that required no polishing. Whimsy gestured toward the armchair opposite. Please, I'd like to go over Sunday evening. You told the police you left the lanterns gathering around 8. Closer to 15:15. Trull corrected smoothly. Brother Jessup can verify that. And you came back through the village? Yes. Did you see anyone? No, it was quite dark by then. You didn't come near Larchmere Cottage? Trull hesitated. I walked past the lane, yes. I often do. It's a shortcut to the green. And you didn't stop in? No. Whimsy tilted his head. Curious, because the dog, Miss Fledge's spaniel, recognized your playing. Not just recognized, reacted. I've played here before, Trull said with a faint apologetic smile. Miss Fledge enjoyed music. She did, but the dog does not. And yet it didn't bark on Sunday night. It didn't bark even when the door was opened. Trull's smile thinned. What exactly are you implying, Lord Peter? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking. He rose slowly, walking to the fireplace. You see, the real question is not where Miss Fledge was last seen. It's what she was carrying. She had with her a revised will, dated and signed, witnessed by the village solicitor, and very clearly not in the possession of the lanterns. I wouldn't know anything about that. No? Whimsy glanced over his shoulder. Then why was it folded into the back leaf of your own manuscript? Trull stiffened. Whimsy reached into the escritoire and removed a sheaf of papers bound with a red ribbon. You left this with the publisher last year, did you not? It's been returned. Unread. And when Bunter examined it, purely out of professional curiosity, he found a thin envelope containing the new will, folded inside the acknowledgments, tucked so carefully that only someone familiar with your filing habits might have noticed. That's ridiculous, Trull said, rising now, voice tightening. I never put it there. You're suggesting Miss Fledge did. I don't know. Maybe she wanted to make a point, to preserve something. Why would I hide it there? To delay its execution, to ensure the previous will stood, to buy time. Whimsy turned to face him fully. It was dated the very day she vanished. She came here intending to meet someone, perhaps to confront them, perhaps even to hand them that will, to say, "Look, it's done, I won't be bullied." That's speculation. No, Mr. Trull, that's sequence. The house was never slept in, the dog never barked, the tray remains untouched, she never made it to tea. But someone did. Someone who knew where the key was kept, someone who could calm the dog, someone who had played here before. Often, Trull's face had gone waxen. The violin case, still dangling from his hand, trembled just slightly. Whimsy continued, voice now gentle. I think you didn't mean to kill her. I think you followed her from the Lantern's Grove, still full of argument. She may have threatened to expose you, your book, your manipulations. She was proud and angry. Perhaps she slapped you. You pushed. She fell. No. Whimsy's gaze did not waver. Then what happened, Mr. Trull? There was a long silence. The kind of silence that grows in corners, that collects like soot behind the words people do not say. Trull stared at the rug. He knelt, opened the violin case, and took out the instrument with great care, as though unwrapping memory. He held it loosely, not to play. She called me a fraud, he said I was stealing people's lives and calling it research. She said she'd told the solicitor everything, that I wasn't what I claimed, that she was revoking her support, and if I didn't leave her be, she'd go to the police. She confronted you here? No, Trull said quietly. On the path, between the copse and the lane. I tried to stop her. I grabbed her arm. She lost her footing. There was a root or a stone, I don't know. She fell back. Struck her head. He looked up, face drawn. I didn't mean for it to happen. I panicked. I waited. She didn't move. I thought if the will was never found, if no one knew she'd come to meet me. You brought her back here. I carried her into the house. I thought if it looked like she'd simply gone to bed. No signs of struggle. Then maybe. But you forgot the tea, the dog, the small things she always did, the small things she never failed to do. Trull sank into the chair again, the violin still in his lap like a relic. I didn't know what to do with the will. I didn't dare destroy it. I shoved it in the manuscript. I thought, I don't know. Maybe I'd retrieve it later. Whimsy said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and gently took the violin from Trull's hands. You may have played badly, Mr. Trull, but you played often enough to leave a signature behind. On the dog, on the silence, on a tune the dead could not hum, but remembered nonetheless. He nodded to Bunter. Call the inspector. I believe Mr. Trull is ready to make a more formal statement. And so the spell of Larchmere Cottage broke, not with thunder or melodrama, but with a soft click of handcuffs and the slow tread of footsteps down a path no longer veiled by secrecy. The air inside the house shifted slightly, as though someone long gone had finally exhaled. It was not quite 10 o'clock when Inspector Brackley arrived, a stolid, competent man with a penchant for buttoned cuffs and unhurried speech. He entered Larchmere with the wary reverence of one used to scenes only half concluded, nodding gravely at Whimsy as if to acknowledge the familiar scent of tided chaos. Trull had been taken to the local station under light escort, having surrendered with the dazed civility of a man who had convinced himself, not entirely dishonestly, that it had been an accident. He had not asked after the dog. Whimsy remained by the fireplace, staring into the ashes like a disappointed scholar. There's something unfinished in it, Brackley, he said without turning. One expects a certain shape to tragedy. A fall, a silence, then a reckoning. But this one hums a bit off-key, don't you think? The inspector, who preferred his tragedy with clear motive and clean documentation, grunted. Seems straightforward enough. Argument, fall, panic. The confession's detailed, and he didn't try to run. No, but I wonder, Whimsy murmured, what else he might not have tried. People seldom make a single bad decision in isolation. One lies, rarely lonely. Brackley sighed and folded his arms. Is this about the manuscript again? Partly. But more the motive. Why risk it all for something so pitiably small? A pamphlet no one would read. A reputation no one really believed in. Trull fancied himself misunderstood, but he lacked the conviction to be dangerous. I'd have wagered on pride, not panic. And yet, he panicked. That implies fear. Of being found out. Possibly, but found out how? Not just exposed as a fraud. Miss Fledge had seen through that weeks ago and still invited him here. What else did she know? Brackley frowned, rubbing his brow. You think there's another layer? I think Miss Fledge never did anything by halves. Whimsy crossed to the writing desk and ran a finger along the edge. She revised her will, made arrangements for the dog, alerted her solicitor, and she left instructions, written, signed in that careful script of hers. That's what's missing. Brackley's brows knitted. Another document. Not legal. Personal. A note, perhaps. A letter. Something she meant to leave with the will. She wanted someone to understand. Not merely that she had changed her mind, but why. People like Miss Fledge don't make silent exits. But if Trull took the will, he didn't find the letter, or if he did, he didn't understand its significance. Either way, it didn't go into the manuscript. It's here somewhere, unless someone else took it. Brackley straightened. You're suggesting another party involved? I'm suggesting opportunity isn't ownership. Whimsy smiled faintly. Let us suppose Trull acted in panic, yes. But who benefits? Who receives the estate under the old will? The lanterns. Brackley gave him a narrow look. You think they had a hand in it? Not necessarily the crime, but in the concealment. Possibly. Whimsy paced slowly toward the window. There's no evidence they knew of the new will, and yet, curiously, they made no effort to look for one. No alarm, no inquiry. Just a rapid occupation of the house and a great deal of dreary tidying. Brackley nodded slowly. So what do you propose? I propose we pay a visit, with our friend the vicar's blessing, if necessary. The lanterns are creatures of appearance, Brackley. If there's anything inconvenient tucked away in a drawer or wedged behind a skirting board, it will not have been burned. That would be unseemly. It was 11:30 when they arrived at the Lanterns' rectory, an austere Georgian relic with ivy-strangled windows and a gravel path that sounded like someone clearing their throat. Miss Sybil opened the door herself, wearing a lilac shawl and an expression of perpetual startlement. "Lord Peter!" she exclaimed. "We hadn't expected visitors." "Dear Miss Sybil," Whimsy said warmly, "I thought I might borrow your memory a moment. It seems you and your brother were the last people to see Miss Fledge on the day she departed." "Do come in," she fluttered, stepping aside. "It's all been very dreadful. We hadn't expected... Well, come through. We've kept everything quite unchanged." The parlor had not changed since Whimsy's first visit, but now it seemed to wear its piety more defensively. A crucifix glowered from the mantelpiece. The pianola had been dusted into submission. Mr. Lantern himself emerged moments later, clasping a theological tome and a face of refined melancholy. "We are grieved to hear of Mr. Trull's confession," he said, sinking into a stiff-backed chair, though not wholly surprised. "Indeed," Whimsy said lightly. "He struck you as volatile?" "Not volatile," Mr. Lantern said with a measured pause, "but morally inconsistent. He lacked humility. When a man speaks too often of higher truths, he is usually dodging the lower ones." "Quite," said Whimsy. "Forgive me. I wonder if I might ask about the Sunday gathering. Did Miss Fledge seem distressed?" "She was. Distracted. One might even say brittle. I attributed it to her growing doubts about her legacy. She hinted that she had made arrangements we might not entirely appreciate. Did she say what arrangements? No, Mr. Lantern replied, only that she would make them very clear in due course. Whimsy glanced at the mantelpiece, where a neat stack of hymnals had been rearranged since his last visit. Curious. And yet you made no effort to contact her solicitor? I assumed the matter was private. Or concluded, Miss Sybil offered helpfully. After all, we'd spoken of her intentions often. She was very loyal to us in the end. Whimsy moved to the pianola, running his fingers idly across the keys. You didn't clear anything from the cottage yourselves, I suppose? Certainly not, Mr. Lantern said sharply. It was entrusted to the church executor. We merely oversaw the pet arrangements. Ah, yes, the dog. Whimsy turned back, his expression mild. Miss Fledge had mentioned to several people that she was worried about the dog, and yet she made no written provision. She must have forgotten, Miss Sybil murmured. Unlikely, Whimsy said, just above the note of politeness. She remembered the vicar's colic and Mrs. Thurkel's slippers. She forgot nothing. There was a silence, weighted and crisp. Brackley stepped forward. I wonder, he said slowly, if you'd mind us looking through her correspondence again, just to confirm there's no letter tucked away. It would be unfortunate to overlook her final thoughts. Of course, Mr. Lantern said after a pause, though I assure you we've kept everything exactly as it was. The desk was in the back room, modest, battered, a bit too tidy. Brackley sorted through the top drawers methodically, while Whimsy stood beside the lamp, leafing through a set of sermon drafts and a set of receipts from a failed organ repair fund. And then, here, said Brackley, withdrawing a thick envelope wedged between the wall and the side of the drawer, addressed, oddly enough, to Miss Fledge herself. Whimsy took it. The handwriting was Miss Fledge's, neat, slanted, unmistakable. The envelope bore no seal. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded page. No preamble, no date, only a few lines, written with restrained fury. If anything happens to me, you must know. Martin is not the only one with secrets. The lanterns are not what they pretend. Look for the original deed, not the copy they submitted. I should have trusted sooner. I was afraid, but not any longer. Let the truth be known. D.F. Whimsy read it twice. Then, without speaking, he handed it to Brackley. So, Brackley said after a long moment, we may yet have company in the dock. Possibly, Whimsy said softly, though they'll arrive dressed for Sunday service. He folded the note and tucked it into his coat. And now, Inspector, I think it's time we located that deed. The real one. Before someone else finds a violin case to hide it in. Whimsy did not speak again until they were well clear of the rectory, walking with Brackley beneath the hush of sycamores toward the green, where dusk had begun to thicken around the hedges like ink seeping through blotting paper. The inspector's boots crunched softly along the gravel path, and for a time the silence between them was the companionable kind, fraught but not yet difficult. She wrote the letter in fear, Whimsy said at last, but not of Trull. She confronted him, yes, but she expected it to be unpleasant, not fatal. Her real anxiety lay elsewhere. Something about the lanterns had begun to unravel for her, and then, in the end, she decided to act. Brackley nodded. The deed. She must have come across some discrepancy. I believe so. The copy the lanterns submitted following the reading of her old will would have gone unnoticed had she not prepared to revise everything. But she had the original, probably kept here. Perhaps she even told them, tipped her hand. People of their sort tend to assume good breeding means weakness. And now, Brackley asked, you think they still have it? I think they're either hiding it or have destroyed it, but destroying something of that weight is harder than it seems, particularly if it's been officially recorded. My instinct says they've merely hidden it. just well enough to preserve plausible deniability. These are people who worship appearance more than truth. They parted at the turning near the vicarage, Brackley bound for the station to secure a warrant. Wimsey continued on toward Larchmere, the lane now silvered with the last edge of twilight. He found Bunter already at the gate, the dog at his feet, ears cocked and nose twitching in the cool air. "She's uneasy again, my lord," Bunter said quietly. "Started growling toward the path a little while ago, as though something had passed." "Human or memory, do you think?" Wimsey asked, crouching to stroke the dog's head. "No matter. I think we're close." Inside, the house still retained the hush of recent truths. Trull's confession lingered in the corners, but so too did something else, an air of decision, of unfinished purpose. Wimsey lit a lamp and went directly to the small sitting room adjoining the study. Here Miss Fledge had often kept correspondence and household papers, neatly arranged in wooden trays and pigeonholes that had been cleared by the solicitor's clerk after her disappearance. Or so they believed. But the lanterns had access in those intervening days, and Wimsey could not be sure everything had been removed in quite the right order. He moved slowly along the bookshelf, examining the backs of the volumes, the ledgers, and then the thick-framed print of the old cathedral that hung above the escritoire. The frame was crooked, not visibly, but enough to catch his eye. He removed it and felt at the back. The brown paper was slit at the top edge, and tucked just behind the canvas was a thick packet bound with green ribbon, its corners worn, its contents familiar in weight. A deed. Wimsey did not open it at once. He carried it carefully to the desk, set it down, and drew a breath. Then, slowly, he untied the ribbon. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a clean, formal deed, original, dated 15 years earlier, and bearing the precise detailing of Miss Fledge's estate holdings. And the second, a carbon copy, altered in 1 key clause. In the original, Larchmere Cottage and its adjacent acre were to be held in trust, then passed to the local historical society. In the copy, that clause had been omitted, replaced with a vague clause reverting the property to designated ecclesiastical custody, a phrase so generically pious it barely meant anything at all. "Tampering," Wimsey said softly, but well disguised. There was no proof the lanterns had forged the copy, only that the original had been hidden and that they had submitted a document advantageous to themselves in its place. But together with Miss Fledge's letter, the implication was damning, and Miss Fledge had known it. Wimsey locked the documents in the escritoire and returned to the window. The wind was shifting now, no longer still, but restless. Somewhere beyond the trees, a church bell tolled the half-hour. He closed his eyes. It was after midnight when Brackley returned, coat damp from the dew. His eyes narrowed when he saw the folder on the desk. "You found it," Wimsey nodded. "Behind a painting, perfectly provincial." Brackley examined the documents in silence. When he looked up, his jaw was set. "This changes everything. It shows motive, precedent." "It shows fear," Wimsey said. "Of exposure, of disgrace. Miss Fledge may have intended to publish these changes, perhaps even make a statement to the Historical Society. But they moved first." Brackley straightened. "I'll take it to the station. We'll question the lanterns again in the morning." Wimsey stood beside him, watching the papers vanish into Brackley's case. "Handle them gently," he murmured. "They've lived so long in the performance of righteousness, they may not know how to speak plainly. They'll try to speak around the truth." "Then we'll speak through it," Brackley said. The inspector departed, and Wimsey returned once more to the study, where the dog had curled beneath the window seat, nose tucked beneath her paw. The house was quiet now, its secrets, for the most part, drawn out and made bare. And yet he sensed something more subtle still resisting the light. Not a mystery, perhaps, but absence. Miss Fledge's voice. Her presence had guided them here, through silences and fragmentary clues, through loyalty and its betrayal. But in all the noise, all the uncovering, what had they truly preserved of her? He moved to the escritoire and drew out the bottom drawer. There, wedged into the rear partition, was a small leather-bound notebook, one he had seen once and forgotten, filled with aphorisms, quotes, and the occasional pointed observation. He opened it at random and read, "Truth is not what survives, it is what refuses to die, even when forgotten. There is dignity in silence, but not justice." He closed the book and sat a while longer. By dawn, Larchmere seemed lighter, its shadows receding, its walls less watchful. And though its former owner would not return, her final stand had not been lost. She had named the right names. She had written the right words. And someone, after all, had listened. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Lord Peter was seated in the drawing-room of the Lanterns' vicarage, politely sipping tea from a porcelain cup painted with trembling violets. The Reverend had sent word through a plainly nervous housemaid that he and Mrs. Lantern were engaged in prayer and would be down presently. Whimsy received this with a civil smile and inquired after the state of the geraniums in the south window, a question that so thoroughly disconcerted the girl she forgot to curtsy. He waited. There was something oddly theatrical in the delay, a pause carefully measured rather than incidental, as though the lanterns required time to arrange themselves into a spiritual tableau before receiving their guest. He made no complaint. It gave him time to observe. The room was scrupulously maintained but not lived in, the cushions fluffed too uniformly, the hearth immaculate, the lampshades unmarked by dust or the gentler soot of use. A shelf above the fireplace contained books in descending order of piety, from Thomas à Kempis to a work on the liturgical colors of ecclesiastical banners. Not a single volume appeared to have been read past page 3. When the lanterns finally entered, they did so hand in hand, dressed in sober colors and with expressions of mild affliction. Mrs. Lantern, Whimsy noted, had exchanged her usual delicate grays for a rather theatrical black, too stiff in the shoulders, suggesting recent and reluctant purchase. Her husband's collar sat slightly askew, and his fingers twitched against the crook of his wife's elbow, a rehearsed sorrow, too neatly pressed. "My lord," said Reverend Lantern, folding his hands as if to conceal their restlessness, "you wish to speak with us?" I did indeed, and I thank you for your time," said Whimsy warmly, "though I do wonder whether it might not be more expedient to speak plainly now rather than later. You see, the original deed has been found." There was a pause, not stunned, not even truly surprised, but tight. "Mrs.?" Lantern's mouth drew in upon itself. The Reverend blinked once, slowly. "I see," he said at last. "And where, may I ask, was it discovered?" "Tucked behind a particularly sentimental watercolor in Miss Fledge's sitting room, quite an excellent choice of hiding place, if I may say so. Who among us wishes to look behind an image of Exeter Cathedral badly done in pastels?" "Then you believe we had something to do with its disappearance?" said Mrs. Lantern sharply. Her voice, which often carried a tremulous humility in public, now had an edge to it, barely disguised steel. Whimsy raised a placating hand. "My dear lady, I am not in the business of belief. I am merely attempting to trace a sequence of actions which, taken together, suggest a motive. The original deed, unambiguously leaving Larchmere to the Historical Society, vanishes from Miss Fledge's papers shortly after she announces her intention to revise her will. In its place, a version appears which is favorable to the Church and, by extension, to yourselves. Miss Fledge, we know, wrote a letter expressing concern and arranged to confront someone the very day she disappeared. I'm not assigning guilt, merely observing that, taken chronologically, one might find the matter inconveniently suggestive." "I assure you," said the Reverend, and now his tone was defensive, trembling on the edge of indignation, "we never laid hands on any such document. If it was taken, it was not by us." "Of course," said Whimsy gently. "And yet, how curious it is that it was never reported missing. One would expect a clergyman, faced with so grave a question of testamentary intention, to insist upon locating the original or seeking clarification before submitting a potentially altered copy. Instead, it was passed along unquestioned. I am afraid the question of who handled it between its removal and its reappearance remains painfully relevant." Mrs. Lantern stood abruptly. "We will not be slandered in our own house." "Then I suggest," said Whimsy, setting his teacup down with deliberate care, "that you provide clarity in its stead. Do either of you recall handling Miss Fledge's papers after her disappearance? Perhaps under the impression that they required temporary safeguarding?" The Reverend hesitated, just long enough. "There were boxes," he said. "Files. We agreed to hold some of them for the solicitor until the official appraisal. We didn't examine them. It was merely a kindness." "A kindness is rarely so profitable," murmured Whimsy. "And tell me, do you believe Miss Fledge was in full possession of her faculties?" "She was eccentric," said Mrs. Lantern with a pinched expression, "independent-minded and occasionally erratic. She had a tendency to take offense where none was intended." "But not mad," said Whimsy. Mrs. Lantern flinched. "No," she said. "Then her intentions must stand." The doorbell rang, sharp and official. In another moment, Inspector Brackley's voice was heard in the hallway, and a constable's boots echoed behind him. Whimsy rose with a faint sigh. "I must apologize for the abruptness, but in matters where the dead can no longer speak, one must ensure the living are quite free of interference. The inspector will wish to speak to you both formally. I suggest candor. It is more difficult than concealment, but ultimately less tedious." As Brackley entered, the Reverend's shoulders sagged visibly. His wife, however, remained rigid, her eyes fixed on Whimsy with a look not of fear, but something closer to fury. "You're destroying a good man's name," she said. "No," said Whimsy. "I suspect he did that himself when he let someone else place a document in his hands and said nothing." Later that morning, as Whimsy and Brackley stood again outside Larchmere beneath the low grey sky, the inspector gave a low whistle. "She nearly did it," he said. "Altered a will, passed it through her husband, and had the poor woman out of the way before she could protest. If it hadn't been for the dog—" "Ah, yes," said Whimsy, glancing down to where the retriever now dozed on the flagstones, one ear flicking at a dream. "The dog who slept through everything, except, of course, the hour her mistress didn't come home. You think it was the wife, not Trull. Trull was a bludgeon, crude, panicked, possibly manipulated. But the woman, she had poise. She knew Miss Fledge's habits, her routines, the limits of the housekeeper's schedule. All she required was a window of 20 minutes and someone to panic on her behalf. He thinks he acted alone, but she gave him the match and the oil." Brackley swore softly. "We'll prove it." "You will," said Whimsy, "but gently. They will fold more completely if no one forces them." He looked up at the house once more. The truth, at last, had begun to loosen its grip. But in every cracked deception, Whimsy saw something deeper, not merely greed, but the human need to rewrite endings, to seize something from the jaws of mortality and pretend it belonged to the righteous. The Lanterns had wanted to inherit a legacy without earning it. They had mistaken inheritance for virtue. Miss Fledge, by contrast, had left her truth where it could be found. And Whimsy, smiling faintly, lit a cigarette and let the wind carry the smoke into the wide morning air. Inspector Brackley had no sooner turned to relay his next steps to the constable than Whimsy, in his usual inconspicuous fashion, had already begun drifting toward the garden path that curled round the north side of Larchmere, where the trees grew tall and untrimmed, and the gravel gave way to moss-covered flagstone. He wasn't done. Not quite. The official narrative was sound, The deed forged or substituted, the house transferred, Miss Fledge vanished, and all arrows pointing, at last, belatedly, toward the Reverend's wife, that gaunt pillar of ecclesiastical righteousness. But the choreography of guilt still left him uneasy. Not unsatisfied exactly, Lord Peter never required melodrama from his deductions, but like a pianoforte left fractionally out of tune, a single key humming discordantly beneath the logic. He paused beside the rusted bench near the well, where a weathered sundial leaned against a broken laurel, and took out a notebook from his coat pocket. The pages were covered in his looping, inconsistent hand. Latin phrases, scraps of overheard conversation, a rough sketch of Larchmere's rear elevation. He turned to a page marked only with two things: a time, 9:48 p.m., and beneath it, in a line that curled upward with a touch of whimsy, the dog didn't bark, but neither did it wait by the door. The dog. Always back to the dog. Animals, unlike humans, rarely lied. They could be mistaken, they could be trained, they could even be drugged, but deceit was not in their nature. The lantern-eyed retriever had been found dozing peacefully in the scullery when the alarm was first raised. It had not paced, not waited at the gate, not scratched or whimpered at the door as it always did when its mistress was late. It had, in fact, behaved as if nothing was amiss, until the second morning. That, Whimsy now realized, had been the truest testimony in the whole affair. It meant, in the simplest terms, that Miss Fledge had returned. Not alive necessarily, but returned. And the dog, comforted by the scent or presence of its owner, had gone to sleep. He stood suddenly and turned toward the house. Inside, the constable was fetching cordoned keys at Brackley's instruction, and the staff, those that remained, had retreated to their own dark corners. Whimsy navigated the service corridor with the easy step of a man who had long since mapped the terrain in his mind. Past the larder, past the disused laundry, to the narrow cellar steps. The stone there was slick and cold, the air clinging to the throat. He didn't need light. The layout of Larchmere had once been symmetrical, but time and fashion had left parts gutted or repurposed. This end of the cellar was seldom accessed, except, curiously, by one person. Cook had mentioned it, offhandedly, that Mrs. Lantern had come to inspect the coal stores the week before the disappearance. Though what business she had poking about down there, the woman had grumbled, is past me. Never been her domain before. Now Whimsy crouched low, running a hand along the panel of shelving beneath the main support beam. Coal dust caked the floor thickly, but one set of prints, light, feminine, deliberate, ran along the wall. He followed them. There, behind a false wall once meant to conceal root vegetables, a narrow recess had been hollowed. Empty now. But the scent remained. Dank wool, old soap, and something fainter beneath. Not decomposition. No. Something like camphor, the remnants of a linen shroud hastily removed. He stood and exhaled. Miss Fledge had not died in the marshes. She had been placed there later. Moved. Her body used crudely, grotesquely, to support a clumsy illusion. The dog's silence made sense. It had seen her. Or rather, it had seen her body brought back to the house before it was later removed and staged. The timing fit. The first night, the dog slept. The second morning, it howled. The murder, then, had not been one of passion or panic. It had been deliberate, premeditated, and the body moved in cold calculation to support a false sequence of time. Whimsy left the cellar silently. Back in the drawing room, Inspector Brackley was poring over the deed. He looked up as Whimsy re-entered. "You look like a man who's found a secret tunnel," he remarked. "Only a rather unlovely niche," said Whimsy. "And perhaps the final evidence that poor Miss Fledge did not wander from her own door that night, but rather came back." "You mean—" "I mean she was murdered here, and kept here, overnight at least, until someone with strong nerves and a plan rolled her down to the reeds, hoping the sogginess would obscure the hour of death, which it did, for a time. Brackley cursed quietly and rubbed his brow. "You're saying Trull didn't kill her at all?" "I'm saying Trull provided the story, a very useful story and one that paints him, rather too convincingly, as the desperate culprit. But no, his panic is genuine, but misdirected. He stumbled upon her body when he came to confront her, poor fool. Found her laid out in the old dining room, or perhaps in the cellar, and thinking it a trap or a test or divine punishment, he fled. By the time he came to his senses, Mrs. Lantern's version had already begun to take root. It is she who moved the body, she who arranged the narrative." Brackley frowned. But why let Trull wander about in confusion? Why not point the finger immediately? Because she hadn't finished yet. She needed the altered will submitted first, and a little chaos helps to smudge inconvenient details. Besides, accusing Trull outright might invite him to confess everything, including what he hadn't done. The inspector stared down at the page. "And the Reverend?" "A moral coward," said Whimsy simply. "Too soft to kill, but far too pliant to oppose a woman who framed piety as destiny. He believed she only hid the deed. I don't think he knew about the rest, at least not until the night after." "So," said Brackley, "we'll need a proper excavation of the cellar, for evidence, and we bring her in." Whimsy nodded. "And quickly, before the Reverend talks himself into another gospel according to selective memory." The two men stepped out into the corridor. The sun had begun to emerge from behind its veil, casting uncertain patches of warmth across the flagstones. As Brackley departed to arrange the warrant, Whimsy lingered a moment by the grandfather clock. It had stopped again, a quarter minute before 10. A trick of age, no doubt, but how curious. 10 o'clock, the very hour Miss Fledge was last seen. He straightened his cufflinks absently, already composing the opening of his letter to Bunter. Something about clocks, something about dogs, something, perhaps, about how silence could sometimes be the most damning witness of all. And as he turned, he could almost hear the faint echo of her voice. Miss Fledge, precise and stubborn in her vows. Complaining, "The dog knows more than you think. He always did." Whimsy smiled. Not quite a joke, not quite a clue. But enough. And outside, the retriever sat at the gate, facing the drive, waiting, as it had not waited that night, for the next thing to come. It was 3 days later, and the rain had finally ceased its monotonous curtain over Larchmere. The rose trellises had slumped under the damp weight, and the lawns bore the soaked, trampled pattern of investigative zeal. Inside the drawing-room, temporarily reclaimed from its funereal hush, the chairs had been rearranged, the hearth lit, and the curtains pulled back to allow a modest slice of late-afternoon sun. Lord Peter Whimsy, one foot draped carelessly over the other, warmed his hands near the fire and surveyed the small audience before him. Inspector Brackley sat stiffly by the sideboard, a notebook, now mostly redundant, balanced on one knee. The Reverend Lantern perched on the edge of a chair as though awaiting sacrament, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. A constable hovered discreetly in the hall beyond. And Mrs. Lantern, unsmiling and still impeccably groomed, sat with the poise of a woman entirely unconvinced of her situation's seriousness. "I have always maintained," said Whimsy, stirring his tea with theatrical slowness, "that England's greatest weakness is not treachery, but decency. A peculiar, crippling sort of decency which, once misguided, permits the most dreadful things under the banner of conscience. Don't you agree, Vicar?" The Reverend looked up sharply, blinked, then looked down again. "I'm not sure I follow." "No, quite," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Most don't at first. You see, Miss Fledge was never the villain of the piece, only the inconvenient reminder of a decision you rather regretted. A woman who, knowing herself wronged, had begun to press against the genteel little fiction you and your wife had built. Her refusal to be quietly buried figuratively, I mean, was intolerable, and yet to confront her openly would have required acknowledging that you benefited from a falsehood. "She was threatening the vicarage," said Mrs. Lantern coldly, "and you know very well that man Trull was obsessed with her." "Oh, certainly," said Wimsey. "He was infatuated with her in the way men sometimes are with those who never return the sentiment. And that was convenient, wasn't it? Perfect scapegoat, already trembling with guilt and jealousy. But alas, he was guilty of nothing but poor judgment. Miss Fledge refused him rather categorically. She was far more devoted to your husband's legacy than you were, as it turns out." Mrs. Lantern made no reply. Her gaze, stony and defiant, fixed itself on a point just over Wimsey's left shoulder. Wimsey sighed softly and set his cup down. The forged will was, I'll admit, surprisingly good. Well, as forgeries go. But sloppy in one regard. The date. You'd assumed Miss Fledge had never mentioned the new will to anyone. Unfortunately for you, she had, rather primly, told her solicitor she meant to lodge it by Tuesday. When she vanished on Monday, it was presumed she never got the chance. But the solicitor remembers the call. So does the clerk. Rather awkward, don't you think? "Conversations are not documents," said Mrs. Lantern evenly. "No," said Wimsey. "But corpses are. And the coroner is now quite certain Miss Fledge was dead by Monday evening, not Tuesday morning. The body had been stored, somewhere dry, dark, somewhere close, then deposited at the marsh before dawn. Why delay unless the plan wasn't ready yet? Unless you needed time to place the altered will in the safe, to discover it in the proper moment of grief?" Brackley cleared his throat. "We've found her scent in the cellar, madam. Your prints, too. And the neighbors recall no dog barking that night. But it barked the next morning when the body had been moved, which means it didn't smell death until then." Mrs. Lantern shifted very slightly in her chair, but her expression remained smooth. "She came back to the house," Wimsey continued almost conversationally. "Perhaps she changed her mind. Perhaps she'd seen something, your husband burning letters, perhaps, and feared he was being manipulated. She returned, and she confronted you. And at that moment, your crusade required only one more sacrifice." There was a long silence, and then the Reverend spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She said we'd be ruined, that I was complicit. She said she'd expose the whole matter and the bishop would cast me out. I tried to reason with her. I tried. You weren't there when she died," said Mrs. Lantern sharply. "You didn't see what she was, the sneering pride, the way she presumed to dictate our lives." "She served you for 17 years, Wimsey said gently. "Carried your accounts, corrected your sermon grammar, even paid out of her own funds to keep your poor box filled. But yes, she was a rather inconvenient reminder that your marriage began in deceit. She remembered too much." Brackley stood and gave a subtle nod to the constable outside, who stepped forward quietly. "I should warn you," he said to Mrs. Lantern. "Anything further you say may be taken down in evidence and used against you." She stood, at last, without haste or tremor. "My conscience is clear," she said. Wimsey rose with her, adjusting his lapels absently. "That," he said, "has never been a reliable indicator of innocence, but it is often an excellent motive." She was led out without protest. The vicar remained behind, head in hands, staring into the fire as though seeking a miracle among the ashes. Outside, the clouds were thinning to strips of silver. Wimsey lit a cigarette with a thoughtful flick of the match, then turned to Brackley. "Do you know," he said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I can quite see how one might be tempted in a house like this." Brackley snorted. "You mean with the vicar's sermons and his wife's theology?" No, said Wimsey. "I mean that peculiar English habit of burying guilt in silence and expecting it to stay buried. Never works. Eventually someone speaks, or a dog howls, or a clock stops at the wrong time. It's quite inconvenient, really." He stepped out onto the gravel and glanced once over his shoulder at the gates of Larchmoor. The retriever was no longer waiting. It had returned to the hearth, to its warm spot near the slippers of the man who still read his scripture and feared his conscience only in dreams. Whimsy smiled faintly and walked on, hands in his pockets, humming a line from King Lear under his breath. The wheel is come full circle. I am here. And with that, he was gone.